One of the most significant events that exemplifies the destructiveness of the biblical God is the ruin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Indeed, we already know how devastating the biblical God can be from where he literally wipes out the earth in the flood. But this is the first time after that incident where he demonstrates a glimpse of that same power. There exist many interpretations as to why the biblical God destroyed these two cities in the first place. One of the more prevailing ideas is that both Sodom and Gomorrah boasted a considerable homosexual population, and as this lifestyle was not congruent with the worship of God, the cities were demolished and its people eradicated. Another popular idea is that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah earned their annihilation because they emulated the same level of sin that had warranted the flood. Genesis 6 tells us that there was wickedness on the earth in those pre-flood times, and that the heart of man was only evil all the time. Yet it is never specific as to what exactly was transpiring that made God so angry. Whatever it was, one might assume it was transpiring at Sodom and Gomorrah too, leading us to believe that these cities were full of debauchery, idol worship, a shunning or neglecting of God, and an increased, almost fevered devotion towards sex and carnal desire. One needs to only look at chapter 19 of Genesis to see that the men of the city, both young and old, wish to have sex with the angels who visit Lot. And despite Lot's efforts to dissuade them, even going as far as to offer his own daughters as a compromise, the men surround his house in a mad lust, and even prepare to break down his door so as to satiate their sexual appetites. From the very beginning, the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah are characterized first by their deviance and their lecherousness. It's bad enough that they would perverse their fellow man, but to exact their fantasies on the angels is not just to attempt rape, but to defile emissaries of the Lord, a desecration of holiness itself. The question then must be asked, was this just typical behaviour in a day of the life of a Sodomite or a Gomorrahite? With the almost casual manner in which the Bible describes these cities and the sin that transpired there, you might be forgiven for coming to the conclusion that rape, orgies, homosexuality, and the desecration of anything holy was actually quite commonplace, and that in the absence of the biblical God, there was an absence of moral virtue. One of the first ways we come to this realization is through the way in which Abraham attempts to negotiate with God in an effort to save the righteous who might have been living in Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham first bargains that if God finds 50 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, he will have to spare both settlements and not destroy the righteous with the wicked. However, it becomes quite telling that after making 50 righteous people the condition for which to prevent destruction, even Abraham himself ends up lowering this number all the way down to just 10 people. Perhaps a sign of how little faith he had that there was even this many good and decent folk living there. This gives us the impression then that of all the people living in these territories, the majority, if not all, were fiendish characters that were simply beyond any redemption. Ergo, if you were living in Sodom and Gomorrah, chances are that you would either be a sinner yourself, or at the very least, reside amongst sin and were complicit in your silence. Interestingly, the Bible notes that God says, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me." With this, it shows us that the neighbours of these territories had a shared consensus about them, that these were nations that were known for debauchery and shame. In fact, you might go a step further and say that the Sodomites and the Gomorrahites embraced these aspects of their culture, or perhaps lack of culture, and were content to live in this depraved society as this is what they liked. Scholar Joseph A. Green notes in the Oxford Guide to People and Places in the Bible that Sodom and Gomorrah's incorrigible wickedness was legendary, and they became archetypes of sinfulness, which further gives us the idea that these were places where bad people revelled in bad things. So again, if you were living here, you'd likely either be born into corruption and thus live this indulgent lifestyle of sex, drugs, and answering to no one, or you were made to assimilate, either by coercion or a need to survive. Only one character is named as being righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, and this is Lot, the nephew of Abraham. When the angels arrive at Sodom, Lot isn't blindly infatuated with them, nor overcome by a visceral desire to be with them, but rather greets the angels with hospitality. In fact, Lot dissuades the angels from spending the night in the square, perhaps sparing them of the abuse that they would no doubt have experienced had they been allowed to go there. Indeed, Lot appears to be well aware of the city's reputation, and perhaps is well aware of how foreigners are received. Why, if they're brazen enough to want to sleep with angels, one can only imagine how they would be with regular men and women who happen to wander through their streets. What's more, you'll notice that when the angels arrive at Lot's residence, he is quick, like Abraham, to host them at his own expense, and even cook them a meal. However, as aforementioned, the way in which the other men of Sodom receive the angels is to intend to rape them. Now, this might merely be the Bible's way to showcase the Sodomites as being undisputedly wicked, but it also works in showing us how the Sodomites, and by association the Gomorrites, might have welcomed foreigners. That is to say, they were rather unwelcoming and would immediately pounce on them and proceed to have their way with them. With all this in mind, you can see why the likes of Sodom and Gomorrah could be imagined as rather rapey, containing streets that you probably wouldn't be able to walk through as a foreigner without attracting unwanted attention. You can imagine this would make women quite vulnerable, but considering angels aren't even safe here, it would seem that as a man, you would also have your hands full fending off sexual predators. Now, whether this applies to foreigners only is not necessarily determined in scripture. We know that Lot was technically a foreigner himself, and yet there is no indication that he was targeted in this same way. This leads some to believe that the sexually charged aggression shown towards the angels was not necessarily a custom of the Sodomites, but rather a reflection of the angels' beauty, and a reflection of how close to the edge of sin the Sodomites lived, that they would very quickly lust for the angels the moment they saw them. Lust is obviously a very big factor in the lifestyle of the Sodomites. You'll notice that the moment the men surround Lot's house, his instinctive resolution is to offer up his daughters in place of the angels, in the hopes that this will satiate their desire. The fact that Lot does this tells us a few things. First, he's undeniably a terrible father, but it also shows us that the Sodomites might not have all been gay, because why else would Lot even bother trying to appease the mob with two of his daughters? What's more, it might also be evidence that Lot knew what their primary interest was, sex, and hoped that sex with his daughters would suffice enough for the men to leave the angels and his home alone. As we can see, this has very little effect, and the mob aren't even remotely interested in Lot's daughters. This might also have been a subtle technique by the Bible to present the Sodomites in the worst possible way, that not only were they rapists, but they were gay rapists, thus embodying more than one sin that ought to have been rebuked at the time. Additionally, we also get the sentiment that Lot's immunity from the men of Sodom, if you will, was merely a fickle thing. For whatever reason, they had not tried to have their way with him or his daughters in all the years that he'd lived there. But in this instance, when Lot tries to prevent them from assaulting the angels, they remind him that they will do worse to him if he doesn't get out of their way. Whether Lot should feel relieved or slightly offended that no one had tried it on with him up until that point is up for you to decide. But the narrative does show us that the potential raping of Lot was not at all beyond them, and that just because they hadn't raped him, it didn't mean that they wouldn't. In fact, they seem to express more interest in him than they do to his daughters, promising to do worse to him. Another idea I've seen put forth is that while Sodom was known for its homosexuality, it was not necessarily a home for rapists, but that the beauty of the angels invigorated this need in the men and served to further exemplify their corruption. As I mentioned earlier, it might have been possible that the Sodomites lived on such a knife edge of utter corruption that the mere sight of the angels was enough to push them over and transform them into mindless, sex-addled beasts that would stop at nothing to feed their craving. This would serve to explain why Lot was seemingly unmolested during his time here, and why there is this cohesion amongst the men of Sodom when it comes to the angels, as opposed to it being a violent freefall. Whilst on the topic of cohesion amongst the Sodomites, there definitely does exist a sense of nationalism amongst the people. We've already established that their neighbours thought of them as wicked, depraved, and possibly even perverted. And considering this was the consensus, even acknowledged by God, you might say that these were people who took pride in their baseness. These were not a God-fearing people. They were not a nation that felt guilty. They were by no means a community that appeared to have second-guessed their lifestyle, nor believe they were even doing anything wrong in the first place. Isaiah confirms this in a rant about the sinners of Israel and Judah, saying, "The look on their faces testifies against them. They parade their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them. They have brought disaster upon themselves." We also see this in the instance involving Lot's wife, who, after being told not to look back as they fled from the impending doom of the city, can't seem to stop herself, which some suggest was a sign of her regret and sympathy for the fate of the nation. Lot's wife was indeed a native of Sodom, and so the fact that she sympathizes with her home shows us that she might very well have shared their morals too. In fact, the Midrash Agada, in its commentary of Genesis 19:32, states that Lot's wife was actually wicked, and that she chastises Lot for showing the angels hospitality, proving that hospitality was not a custom practiced in Sodom, and that rather quite the opposite was expected. The account even refers to inhospitality being a law in Sodom, where strangers and foreigners were to be treated with extreme prejudice, and even violence. You can then see why Lot's wife was so angry at her husband for inviting the angels in and preparing them a meal, for her own customs and her own people deigned that these entities ought to have been accosted. What's more, in this account, it is she who tells the Sodomites about the presence of the angels, for she is made by Lot to go door to door asking her neighbours for salt to serve with the meal. This might also then be why she is turned into a pillar of salt upon the city's destruction, with the Midrash explaining that she sinned with salt and thus was punished with salt. From what we've discussed then, sexual perversion, rape, orgies, and possessing a lustful attitude might very well have been part and parcel of living in the likes of Sodom and Gomorrah, particularly if you were a foreigner. It's quite telling that the biblical account appears to focus exclusively on this aspect, or at least Sodom becomes characterized by this aspect, considering the attitudes of the men, who wish to sleep with the angels and then threaten to rape Lot if he gets in their way. Idolatry, thievery, or even murder don't appear to be transgressions associated with Sodom in the biblical narrative, and whilst this doesn't prove that it wasn't happening there, it does show us that perversion and lustfulness were two of the city's biggest problems. Whether or not Sodom and Gomorrah were actual real places remains up for scholarly debate. There does not appear to be any agreement amongst archaeologists, with some arguing that neither place ever even existed. That being said, some archaeologists do argue that the whole area where Sodom and Gomorrah were said to stand could have homed several bustling cities in the early Bronze Age, when a wetter climate would have sustained life. An ancient archaeological site in the Jordan Valley, known as Telesaidia, is one such place, where according to archaeologist Jonathan Tubb, an early olive oil factory was discovered, which gives us a glimpse as to how sophisticated these ancient civilizations were. Tubb also believed that the sites like the early Bronze Age Telesaidia were the only towns in the area that could have been Sodom and Gomorrah from the Bible, or at least served as inspiration for the cities in this narrative. If we were to combine this idea with what we know from the biblical account, what we have is a fairly advanced civilization, capable of not only producing their own commodities, but also having their own infrastructure. Indeed, these were not nomads feeding off the land, but a populace who were producing goods and produce at a mass scale. With such facilities as an olive oil factory, they obviously valued commerce and most likely had some form of an economic system. This raises the question then as to who the Sodomites were trading with. We know from the aforementioned Midrash account that foreign relations weren't the city's strong point. So could it be the case that Sodom was trading exclusively within its own borders, and possibly with Gomorrah? Or did they have business relationships with the same people they'd willingly abuse? With that logic, you might have been able to enter Sodom with the intention of trading goods and services, but how you were received would leave much to be desired. Besides that, your safety was certainly not guaranteed either. The issue with all this is that much of it is speculation. There are no historical accounts of either Sodom or Gomorrah, and the Bible really doesn't offer much in the way of a day-to-day picture of their society. It is the attempted rape of the angels that the Bible focuses on, a mere snapshot from Sodom's history, and so to be fair on them, it would be irresponsible to reduce their entire society down to this one moment. Remember, Genesis 13:10 describes this area as well-watered, like the garden of the Lord, insinuating that it was a prosperous place and a land that was well looked after. The Bible would have us believe that the Sodomites were evil, sexed-up maniacs trying to rape everyone, but it's likely, as we've seen from the proposed olive oil factories of Telesaidia, that Sodom and Gomorrah had agriculture, infrastructure, and an economy based on their produce. These then were not a people focused exclusively on lust, but perhaps a people focused on profit. This might be demonstrated by Ezekiel 16:49-50, where we are told, "Now this was the sin of Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty, and did detestable things before me." This description frames the city in a rather different light, perhaps even a capitalist light, where the people value their profits and their possessions more than they value their fellow man. They shun the poor, shun the needy, and much like the Midrash that frames Lot's wife as against the sacred law of hospitality, it gives us the impression that the rest of Sodom was like this too. If we then look to Isaiah 1:10-17, we also find another account that associates Sodom not with sexual deviancy, but instead general injustice and religious hypocrisy. Isaiah tells us, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear your worthless assemblies. Your new moon feasts and your appointed festivals I hate with all my being. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow." Here, the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah are portrayed less as godless people, but more so as people who only sacrifice to God when it's convenient for them. Notice how they only sacrifice the fat of the already fat animals, or the blood of bulls, rams, and goats, but never the actual animals themselves. These citizens then demonstrate a similar selfishness of Cain, who also only sacrifices the fruits of the soil, but kept the first fruits and the better yield of crops for himself. Again, you might imagine Sodom and Gomorrah in this light as major capitalist societies, and much less as societies that were sexually deviant. Again, Isaiah makes no reference to the accusations that Genesis makes of Sodom and Gomorrah, and instead focuses on a populace that evidently wants more for themselves and less for everyone else. Even when they have the excess to offer the poor, they prefer to maintain it for themselves. What's more, their worship of God, again proving that they weren't atheists exactly, but were far more liberal with their religion, is done so with lukewarm enthusiasm. They conduct Sabbaths, festivals, and feasts, but these aren't conducted with the right sentiments and are perhaps more like parties for their own enjoyment, rather than as a tribute to God. With this in mind, if you were rich, you'd probably have a decent time at Sodom and Gomorrah, for you wouldn't go hungry, you'd live a life of abundance, and you'd be thoroughly entertained through the many parties, festivals, and feasts that were taking place there. The most ominous part of this society is that God accuses them of having blood on their hands. Perhaps then the people here were violent and cruel, building their wealth on the backs of slaves and cheap labour, and or killing their neighbours if it meant furthering themselves. God even tells them to defend the oppressed, implying that Sodom and Gomorrah were more inclined to take advantage of the oppressed, or were the oppressors themselves. According to chapter 19 of the book of Jasher, Sodom and Gomorrah are once again illustrated as sexually motivated nations, perhaps even more vividly than the traditional biblical version. Here we are told that the people were such a horny bunch that they actually erected beds in the streets of the cities, and that if a man came to these places from another territory, they would force him down onto one of these beds and have their way with him. The account tells us, "And as he lay down, 3 men would stand at his head and 3 at his feet, and measure him by length of the bed. And if the man was less than the bed, these men would stretch him at each end, and when he cried out to them, they would not answer him." This graphic account only gets so much worse, where we are told that if the victim cried out, the men would at first ignore him, before commenting that this is what is done to any man that ventures into their land. Because of this, it made the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah unvisitable, and neighbouring territories would generally give them a wide berth. We are told, "And when the men heard all these things that the people of the cities of Sodom did, they refrained from going there." The Jasher account then tells us of a strangely vindictive custom that the people of Sodom practiced. They would give poor people who came to their city silver and gold as a sort of mock generosity, but would then inform merchants not to sell them anything. When the poor stranger eventually died from hunger in the city, assuming he hung around for that long, the people of the city would take the silver and gold back, and then fight over whatever belongings he had on his person. This was the hatred that Sodom and Gomorrah seemed to have for foreigners, that if they weren't raping them in the street, they were starving them out for the sole purpose of robbing their corpses. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah then cannot be reduced to a single act or a single category of sin. The biblical account presents a society in which corruption had become ordinary, something woven into the rhythms of daily life and reflected in the behaviour of its people. Sexual violence was certainly part of that corruption, but it existed alongside a deeper contempt for the vulnerable, a hatred for foreigners, and a deliberate rejection of the ancient law of sacred hospitality. The difference in the way the angels are treated at Sodom when compared to the likes of Abraham is stark, who is shown to feed the angels and even wash their feet. But again, according to various midrash and extra-canonical texts, the rejection of the sacred law of hospitality is only one transgression forming Sodom's considerable rap sheet. Here, violence replaces justice, cruelty replaces compassion, and greed becomes the nation's key characteristic. In this respect, Sodom and Gomorrah recalled the world before the flood, a world in which the earth had become filled with all kinds of terrible sin. Therefore, regardless of how you look at it is no wonder why these two cities were dealt with in the way that they were. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.